but I really wanted to this time look at sort of a existential challenge, I think, for our discipline. And when I say discipline, I mean UX research and UX design largely. And I've been thinking about this while I was in my role at IBM, and I did a lot of hiring at IBM. We actually took the design team at IBM from 2013. We had like 235 designers and researchers, up to 3,000 in fairly quick order. And what I want to show you in terms of what I've found here is that I'll go through really a medical diagnostic and prognosis and prescription sort of method. I thought that model might work well here. Let's look at the vital signs. Let's look at the diagnosis of where we're at, what the prognosis might be, and then I've got 8 steps for the prescription as I would specify it or suggest it. And like I said earlier, all of us have been thinking about this, I'm sure, and you may have your own views on this as well. I've also been thinking about a lot of the advice that I've heard people give designers and researchers, and just saying, things are fine. You just have to wait. And I think, no, I think we have to do more than that and realize where the organization's at. So just to tell you a little bit about where sort of the bottom up of my affiliations here. So I was at IBM. My most recent position was vice president of global user experience research. And prior to that, I was director of design for many, many, many years. And during the early period, when we had the 235 designers and researchers, and then really brought design and also design thinking across to the whole company. I worked with each of the business units of the company, introduced them to that, got hiring in each of the units and the like as well. So I always saw the canvas of the company as something that needed to be designed, and that we could actually design the way that we did this work. But I'm going to make a number of comments as we go through of even instances where I think that we could have done better through that transformation. So let me go and start with sort of the assessment. And these are some numbers. So since 2022, UX job postings have reduced by 72%, which is pretty staggering for a discipline. When you look at the UX design and research job postings from 2013 to 2024, you also see, I look at this and see this is really the trajectory that IBM was on as well. Although our hiring trajectory was even steeper than this, but there was this huge focus on building up till just the peak of the pandemic, and then a precipitous drop, after that. If you look at job postings by discipline, is also really interesting in the sense that the red line, the one at the top, is engineering, and it's doing just fine in terms of being way ahead of the other disciplines, but also experienced a drop. Everybody experienced a drop, right? Companies have just been downsizing, period. And then you see the others largely clustered together, but still with UX research as the bottom line. When you look at chief design officer positions, I often talk to the leaders of many companies talk about chief design officer is really the preeminent position to get into. That's where everybody wants to get to. And they also went through a fairly significant drop. And when you look at job losses of all sort of disciplines, you see that engineering hardly dropped at all, but they still did drop some 10%. Product management, almost 30%. But look what happened to UX design and UX research, right? Just staggering in terms of the job losses. Interesting when you look at, again, back to the chief design officer roles. Again, chief technology officer, there's a message here every time it's engineering. It's just fine, but it's still a little bit of a drop. Marketing next, product officers next, but way above, some 40% reduction in the chief design officer roles across the industry. So all of that's pretty sobering, right? And my sort of diagnosis of all of that is that this is what you might think of as being a discipline in decline. And my assessment, and I'll unpack each of these, is that it was due to a bunch of environmental factors. One is undisciplined financial planning. I put this in the large companies. They screwed up, quite frankly. The second is the upskilling of non-UX roles. The third is questioning the value of UX roles. And the latter two need some explanation, but the movement of the Overton window, if you are aware of what that is, I'll explain what it is. I think it is descriptive of also what is happening to society more generally, as well as for our discipline. And then the last one will need a lot more explanation, but the house in which to practice, which design and research do not have, I would submit. So when I say undisciplined financial planning, let's look at just Meta, right? This is Meta's hiring, right? And then layoffs. And of course, they just announced another 5% that's going to happen over the next month, I think, right? So who does that? Hires that many people and then lets that many people go. That's undisciplined financial planning. I would suggest that it's almost even immoral to do it that way. So I think that's part of the problem. And that goes for our discipline, but also other disciplines as well. The whole reckless hiring and then reckless layoffs. The other one is that, and this is one that I was presenting at a conference in Chicago, the CoLab conference, a bunch of researchers. And we got talking about that another factor that sort of led to this decline was the upskilling of non-UX roles, right? We've called it democratization when it comes to UX research roles and the like. And I'm guilty of this myself. I mean, I've taught many people how to do design thinking, for example. What's interesting, though, is that when I teach it, and I still teach it to executive MBA students and directors and senior executives in healthcare organizations, I always make sure that I reinforce that they're learning how to think like designers and researchers, but they still need designers and researchers, and especially still doing research. So I never teach a class without whoever it is needing to do actual research, for example. And so, but I presented at a local university a few years ago. It was a cross-disciplinary lecture. And I also presented, this whole notion of what design thinking was all about and the like. And so, but I made the point several times during that talk saying that, and by the way, when you have learned to do design thinking, you're not a designer. And I kept on saying that. But the dean of the business school at the end, when it was Q&A time, actually said, hey, Karel, you know what? With all this focus on design thinking, do we need designers? So this gets into people's thinking, that they think that if they're doing design thinking and they do a few exercises, they may not need designers. I honestly think that there's some misguided executives in companies thinking that that's the case, that you just need to train some product managers in how to do design thinking and you'll be perfectly fine. So I think that's another factor. And A lot of people that do teach design thinking don't necessarily put the caveat in that I do on a regular basis. And so they give the impression that when you learn design thinking, you actually know how to be a designer and a researcher. So I think that's another factor that contributes. I think there's also a questioning the value of UX roles. And I can characterize, I think, what happened at IBM. So we made the case for hiring a lot of, 3,000 basically, or close to 3,000 designers and researchers. But it was basically on the basis of companies knowing that they needed to bring in these disciplines. It was basically on faith. A lot of it was the importance that Apple put on design, and Apple at the time was the most valuable company in the world, right? And they had a chief design officer. They don't anymore, right? And so there was this whole sense of that organizations needed this, and they took it on faith. But then they didn't get any hard data with regard to the business value they were getting, right? I remember having a conversation at IBM making the case for starting to collect some more hard-nosed business value data with regard to what we were doing. And I was given the feedback that no, that we didn't want to be the design police. We were just going to you just needed to do this stuff because organizations needed to do it, which at the time made sense. That was sort of the time that we were in. But that lack of hard evidence, I think, is now catching up to, many companies. There's also an impatience with the lack of speed, which I think is also something that and I'll get back to in a minute. And then the third one is really this having a little knowledge of the discipline, even though we've been around for a long time, there's still a lack of understanding what designers and researchers actually do, other than making things pretty and telling you after doing a study with some users that your design or your product is all fine. Going deeper than that is usually still lacking in many of the leadership roles within companies. There's this concept of the Overton window. So this is basically a concept of, if you see the visual on the bottom left, of taking a snapshot of what kinds of things are currently not only acceptable, but even, popular. And there's policies made for it and the like, versus things that are unthinkable, radical. And ideas go through this notion of this Overton window. So they start off being unthinkable. You'd never think of legalization of cannabis as an example, right? And then it becomes, it's sort of radical. Then it's sort of acceptable. And then maybe it's sensible. And then you get to actual policies that, Canada is one of the leaders in this area, right? But then certain things move out of the Overton window as well. So things like smoking is outside of the window and just and a stayed out of the window. I would say that, abortion was fairly squarely inside, the window, but in certain jurisdictions, especially south of the border, that seems to be moving out of the Overton window. Trans rights, I thought, were getting toward being into the Overton window, but those are clearly, moving out, certainly south of the border. Same thing with climate change awareness, diversity education, diversity, equity, and inclusion is another one that we thought was pretty squarely in the Overton window, but certainly south of the border, and I think probably in Canada, and certainly in many companies too, right? Look at what's happened to the major IT companies right now, all turning their back on DEI, right? Who would have thought that was going to happen? Well, that's a change in culture, right? So I could go through the rest of them, but including that Canada is a 51st state, as an example, right? Which is disturbing because somebody entered, gives you the thought of that this needs to be, It could be even in jest. I don't think it was. But at the same time, it makes people talk about it and starts to do surveys about it and stuff like that. And so this is how changes happen in society. And I would argue that, for workplace flexibility, immigration, and also even democracy are kind of on the edge somewhat, worryingly. Similar, though, to embracing design. I think design was pretty squarely inside the Overton window, but I think with what the stats we went through and the like, we're kind of going out of that window. And I think we have to do more and not just wait to see how we actually change things. So the final sort of diagnostic idea is this notion called house in which to practice. So I first got this idea. It's not like a well-known thing. I did some time as a clinical psychologist a career or two ago, and I had a supervisor that we were in a hospital, and I was frustrated at what we were able to do in that hospital. And that supervisor said, no, you have to realize that psychologists and social workers and like in a hospital do not have a house in which to practice. The practice that the house that we're practicing in is owned by physicians and business leaders. So physicians will always make the call in a hospital, and the others, in order to be an effective member of that team, you have to know your place, and you can come and go. You can be central and really important, at other times not. But physicians, I guarantee, are always going to be core to a medical organization. And I would suggest in technology companies, it's the same, right? That it's business leaders and now engineers. Look at those stats that I showed you earlier. Engineering is the core discipline, right? And so is business leaders. But designers and researchers, I would submit, are guests in someone else's house and don't have our own house in which to practice. Some could argue that agencies are more like that, but that is it's not quite a house in which to practice. You're still beholden to, the people that actually pay the bills and the like. So, but I think it's an important concept in terms of how we should think about how important design and research is in companies. There was a time at IBM when design and research could do no wrong. We got money thrown at us, all largely due to one CEO, Ginni Rometty, that basically put us on a pedestal. We didn't have to follow any of the rules, right? But that was a honeymoon. That's not reality. In most places, think of Apple. Apple also went through the same thing. They have a chief design officer. They could do no wrong. It's not the same anymore at even Apple, right? So this whole notion of house in which to practice. So my prognosis is twofold. One is it's not good if we don't change anything. Things might just get a little bit better, but I honestly think that we could make it great if we actually take the prescribed medicine, which I'm going to describe to you. So my prescription is eightfold, and I'll dig into each of these again in turn. The first is use research and our own skills to design our own careers and also our resumes, by the way. Learn business and engineering disciplines. Focus on having business impact. Increase the speed of your work. Work out regularly with other disciplines. Implant a prosthesis, generative AI. Perform a pre-mortem regularly on what you're doing, and also still be somewhat patient. So I experienced in my role and also in my working with people across the industry that designers and researchers often don't generally consider using their own practice on themselves, right? Everybody should understand us. You should actually use these methods ourselves, right? So think about the people that own the house that we work in. I think you want to use some research methods to understand what the business leaders, what the engineers, what the product managers, what they want, how they tick, how to work directly with them, how to put your work in a form that integrates appropriately with what it is that they're doing, right? So, and also even things like I do a fair bit of coaching, and it surprises me that when a designer or researcher prepares like a resume, they think about it from themselves. They do what we often say that engineers do. They build it the way they think that it should be done, and they don't think of the user. Well, how much of the time do designers and researchers, when they're putting together resumes, think about who's going to read this thing, right? And see it from their point of view. Does it make sense to make it 50 pages long because you had that many projects? Or does it make more sense saying, here's 10 projects that are on one page saying these are all kind of roughly the same, but these are the main things, the kind of impact that I had, to lighten the load on the person that's reading this stuff, right? But also even from their point of view. And then in the interviews as well. And I do role plays with people that I'm coaching. And a lot of the time it's not thinking about what that other person just asked you and how you would address that question. A lot of the time it's more, this is what I want to say. I'm really proud of I did this, and as opposed to really thinking about what they really want and the person that you're wanting to be hired by. And so across the board, everything from strategic foresight to doing user research, I just think that we need to be thinking more of ourselves and our own career using the practice of design, and that portfolios and resumes also need to be the best piece of design work you've ever done, right? So I'll come back to that again in a minute. Learn business and engineering disciplines. We're a guest in houses that are run largely by business and engineering. And so I think we need to know more about that. Think about a chief design officer that is on the C-suite. C-suite members are expected generally to know all about all the happenings and all the various parts of a company. And at least a few of the chief design officers I have talked to in the past have taken the view that they're there to represent design, as opposed to they're there as a member of the C-suite, knowing enough about business, knowing enough about engineering to be able to be a contributor across the board and still represent design. But I think across the board, if we really want to turn the corner on this, and do you need to go get extra degrees in these areas? No, you don't. This kind of information is so easy to access now that you can really brush up on your knowledge of each of these areas, and that you should be able to read a balance sheet. You should be able to see understand the core technologies, and also what it's going to take to implement, let's say a design idea that you have. So again, in moderation, but don't think that, oh, well, I'm just going to hang with my designers and researchers and I don't need to, know anything beyond that discipline. Huge one is focus on business impact. And in fact, one of the last things I did in my role at IBM, leading the research team, is in fact building a set of metrics that we could track. And also, I also stated for our researchers that a lot of the time they thought that their job was done when they finished the study. I said, no, you've only done half the job. Your job is done when, with the insights that came out of the research you did, are in a product and are being used by users of that product. That's when your job's done. So not every junior researcher needed to follow that all the way through, but certainly the senior researchers needed to make sure that they flowed through the system, the insights that came out of their research to make sure that it had that impact. Because ultimately, when you think about the return on investment of you being at a company, that's often the way companies work, and they're increasingly working that way. If you can't draw the line between what you did and what impact it had on the company, either in a really hard numbers sense, or at least in a sense of like, here's some, trade press reviews and the like that show the impact of what we did. You're not there just to, as researchers, do studies. You're not there as a designer just to create designs. No, your job is actually to use those skills and that craft to create business impact for the company. Increasing the speed of your work. I would often hear that we need to explain to product managers and engineers and business leaders why it took longer to do our research and our design work. I think that in this climate we're in right now, I wouldn't advise that. I would say instead, look at the various methods that you have at your disposal. Find something faster. If you really need to go do something that is going to take more time, do it in addition to something that is faster, that's going to have impact and the like as well. So I think there is this real sense of that we're not here to explain more about our discipline. I think we need to take seriously that we need to kind of draft in, if you will, to the speed of the organization. I mean, there were a couple of projects when I first started my role. I was a VP of research for 2 years, and when I first got the role, I traveled to many of the locations and did some workshopping on what the major challenges were, and there were some studies that were done by several people that took several months. And when they finally presented the results of that work, that it wasn't relevant anymore. It's like, well, number one, find something faster to do. Number two, stay in sync with what's actually going on. And so this whole notion, and they were saying, well, no, but this really important work to do, we just need to explain it better. I said, no, you got to draft into the speed of the organization, and you need to know enough about your discipline to know what kinds of work you need to do to have the kind of impact. And some of the time, you don't have to be doing work that is in sync with the speed of the product's schedule. So other work that you need to go do may need to be done without a timeline, that you need to basically understand your users better. Well, so spend some time doing that out of cycle so that you have enough information for the next release that you can just pull those data. But you don't have to put that kind of piece of work, as part of the overall project sort of timeline, is what I would suggest. Work out regularly with other disciplines, and I don't mean that necessarily just in terms of in the gym. I just mean that spend more time with the other disciplines. Again, when we created the larger 3,000 designers at IBM, we also created studios around the company around the world, about 100 studios in total. And they were by and large only designers and researchers, right? So business people, engineers and the like would have to come into that space. But designers would spend most of their time with other designers and researchers. I would argue that we'll do better if we are working more closely and are still have distinct disciplines, but really have an understanding, even as friends, what the other disciplines are like, how they work, what their vocabulary is like. One of my greatest observations when I was doing I spent a year working with design schools and design programs within universities. And I think this is where the problem begins, because design schools and universities teach designers, and engineering schools only teach engineers. business schools only teach business people. And when people come out of those programs into a company, they need to now know how to work together. And they don't even share a vocabulary. You know, what one says, the other one interprets, incorrectly. I've been advocating for a long time, and I've also sponsored a number of programs at universities to drive more cross-disciplinary education, at least a, undergraduate fourth year capstone multidisciplinary a course to really start this conversation with other disciplines. You need to know them, and yes, they need to know you, and they will learn that by you spending more time, with them. But it's also the case that, as I said earlier, designers and researchers don't have a house in which to practice. And I would like to submit, I know I'm being harsh, but we are guests in somebody else's house. And that other house is controlled by these other disciplines. So I think it behooves us to understand them. We would like them to also understand us. But if we want to be strong in our roles, I would like to suggest, be strong in understanding their disciplines. This notion of implanting a prosthesis, and the concept is really appropriate. When you think of like an exoskeleton giving you extra power, they've now got some pretty cool AI-based ones for that too, and they're looking at, workers in warehouses be able to be stronger and not get as tired by wearing, that kind of gear. Same concept here for design and research, to use the best of generative AI to augment your role, and the line is often, is your job going to be replaced by AI? And the usual response is, well, no, your job's likely going to be gone, but not for somebody that is using AI appropriately, right? So you're vulnerable if you don't actually know much or use much of generative AI, is the argument. But I would like to suggest that what you do is think about it from the point of view of this is a symbiosis. It's both you doing your job differently, and I'm also going to take you through a little bit of work of what I was doing also with Karel Vredenburg at IBM before I left, which was for UX research, thinking about how we should actually design generative AI into our products as well, rather than just saying, put a link everywhere and encourage everybody to do this. I mean, it's ridiculous the way that generative AI, I think, is pushed right now, especially also because it is killing the earth, right? A query with a Google search and a query using ChatGPT uses 866% more energy than that Google search, right? So I think as designers and researchers, I think we need to be responsible to say, okay, let's now do our job in not only using generative AI to augment our own skills, but also we need to be using it to effectively design products that use generative AI, and not this bizarre concept that's currently being used across many companies. And so as an example, so doing research and analysis. So let's say we're wanting to look at a domain. This is the use case of you're now using a new way of doing research, because you're now going to determine how to incorporate generative AI into a product that you're developing. So if we're looking here at the domain of a designer or researcher, you have to decide whether you want to make the scope the day in the life or the full project, let's say. Then you're going to do your conducting of your generative research, whatever methods you want to use. Then you're going to look at and say, okay, based on all of that research, let's look at what tasks may be appropriate to consider for using generative AI for. So let's say the role of the researcher. Let's look at, and we did this, synthesizing interview transcripts, right? It's about 30% of researchers' time, and it generally is not something that researchers like doing all that much. So pretty good candidate for thinking about using generative AI. Then you need to assess the AI capabilities of doing that particular piece of work. So is AI ideally suited to the task? And also, can it be done ethically, for example? And then you also need to evaluate the energy use. Is this something that you need to be using a large language model for and hammering it constantly with a new query? Or is there a small language model that may well suit the task better? And can you limit running it multiple times? What are the ways in which you, if you're going to be implementing this, could you actually implement it in a way that is not going to be eating up the resources of the world? And then you want to evaluate the effectiveness of that. And let's say the workflow works well, you got a 25% productivity increase. Cool. That's how I would suggest we should be actually designing, these things, as opposed to let's try to use generative AI everywhere possible, right? And if you're doing design thinking, and that stakeholder map, yeah, you need a user, you need to have AI in the picture, you need to include the earth, I would think, as well, especially when you're looking at AI. And that scenario map might look at, like, here's the tasks, here's what the human would end up doing, this is what the AI would do. You can then flip it into the storyboards and the prioritization grid. Here's an example of that. So we use generative AI for the podcast that I do. So we look at sort of the guest, we look at the producer and the co-host, the AI, the listener, the earth, and then we have this scenario map. So we have each of the tasks, which ones the human's going to do, which ones the AI is going to do, and then some notes. Like, for example, exploring a guest. We don't use ChatGPT or any of the other generative AI for that. We just do a Google search and maybe read about them on Wikipedia and the like. And then generating questions, we do use generative AI, for. We use it to record the episode and edit it. But we are able to, especially with Riverside, which is the tool we use, I could not have to actually use my voice at all. It has all kinds of voice samples of mine, so it can actually generate a really convincing version of my podcast without me actually recording it. But that's where I draw the line. I said, no, I want to still make this human. I just want to have a prosthesis. I don't want it to replace me, right? And then in producing the episode, we use AI again. And then the show notes, we use it heavily for. And then when we post the episode, we do that entirely as a human. So again, when we look at the prioritization grid, the pretty good quality and highest productivity would actually be using generative AI to generate the actual episode, and without me even needing to use my voice at all, right? But we choose not to do that. And I think that we always need to make the call on as well. Is this something that makes sense ethically, morally, to be able to automate, and being more thoughtful in terms of deciding which tasks should be done with AI versus not. So, but that's all about leaning into that. Now, this is something I just saw this morning. It's doing a little bit of strategic foresight. So a weak signal that I saw is that companies like Anthropic and Perplexity are replacing designers, PMs, and engineers, or each of those roles, with a new role called the design engineer, which is largely an engineer that has some sense of design. They're starting to go down this path of replacing tasks by other disciplines or by AI. And so I would like to submit that the way we get ahead of this, or at least parallel with it, is to deeply get into generative AI in terms of your own speed in doing your work, the quality of your work, still keeping in mind that you want to keep your quality up. So if there's something you're doing with generative AI that just is not cutting it, and I've certainly come across many of things like that, you raise that in terms of your own work, but then also use these techniques to be able to design and show that you're the leader in how to design for generative AI, rather than some product manager just saying, we're going to use it all over the place and your product's going to suffer because generative AI won't be as effective as a human at doing that. And then lastly, I've loved this concept of a pre-mortem. Anybody that's done any amount of workshopping, especially with startups, sees how important this is. So startups typically, when they come up with their ideas, it's great. It's going to change the world. It's going to give everybody, the ability to share pictures and stories with their friends. What could go wrong, right? They're all really positive. They don't think about, unanticipated consequences, right? And so this notion of the pre-mortem for doing product work is well known. I think we need to use it on our own career work as well. So when you put a career plan in place, based on maybe some of the things I talked about here, still practice this pre-mortem. Think about it's in the future, and the career plan that you've been putting together has now been implemented, but it's been a total and utter failure. Why did it fail? Use that as a thought exercise. And then what mitigations do you need to put in? How do you need to still change what you've done here? Tweak, what it is you've been doing as well. So whatever you're doing, go through this notion of saying, my wonderful plan that I was going to do this, this, and this. You can use this in other parts of your life as well. I think it's really effective to get away from, and I have to do that myself all the time because I tend to be a very positive person, to be able to possibly put the brakes on things or rethink things by imagining that everything that you've done and you're planning to do has now failed. How do you change your plans, and how do you factor in the kinds of things that you discovered when you imagined what that failure looked like to be able to change your trajectory? And lastly, I said that you shouldn't only be patient, but I do think there's some level of patience required. I just looked at the stats for January. Things are actually looking a little bit better than they were in the past, but it's obviously not based on very many data points. But I do believe that companies are going to realize that they need designers and researchers. You can only go so long. Quickie aside, I now, in running a nonprofit, pay for and use a number of products from these companies. So I'm on the other side, if you will. And the design of the major products that come from many of these companies absolutely suck still. There's so much work to be done, and they seem to be getting worse. And I think they're probably getting worse because they're not paying attention to designers and bringing in designers and researchers. So I think at some point it's going to be like, oh, you know what? Somebody is going to be investing appropriately in design and research and is going to blow the others out of the water. So I think there's going to be some of that. But I think the Overton window also won't keep moving in its current direction, right? It never does. It sort of moves backwards. And I think that society is doing that right now all across the world, but led by the US, in my view. But that too will change over time, right? So I think that you do still need a healthy sense of being patient. But what I would recommend as well is that while you're being patient, and let's say you're not in a role, you haven't landed a new role, let's say, or you're in a role already in a company, but you're concerned about it, or it's not moving anywhere, and or you're even in a leadership position, but you want to just ready yourself more effectively for promotions in the future. Whatever those situations are in, I think it's a great time sort of to practice and improve. So in a lot of the things that I've been saying, if you currently are out of work, you've got a lot of time to be able to spend on addressing some of the things that I've talked about here. And if you're in a role but are dissatisfied with it, and you want to look for, another role and a better role, focusing on a number of these things will, I think, elevate your promotion capability, as well. And I think leaders of design and research absolutely need to be focusing on these things for not only their own careers, but also in the teams that they're leading, as well. And good things will come to those who wait, but people who wait and don't just if you're not in a role, don't spend all of your time just applying. Spend time too on further improving yourself. I did a few podcast episode interviews that on my Life Habits podcast that are on these topics as well. And I think there's some really good advice out there by several people on doing this as well. But so I just want to end with a few thoughts on that. It might all look dire, but at the same time, I think that our discipline needs, a kick in the pants, quite frankly. And I think that is it a fault of a lot of things that are happening? Yes, right? But we can't change those things necessarily, but we can change ourselves. And in the ways that I talked about here, I would like to suggest that we lean in to at least some of this to further enhance our discipline, our employability, our promotion ability, and the like as well. So thank you so much for listening to what I have to say. I also said at the beginning, a lot of you will probably have a lot of points of view on this yourselves in terms of where we've gone through here. A lot of long-term, really experienced leaders here, and so also some people that are probably experienced this today themselves as well. So I'm looking forward to getting into a conversation about this next, and I'll stop sharing.